Cool. Thank you so much. And thank you all for coming out and watching me this afternoon. So I thought I'd just kick off a little bit, just talking about myself, as you know. So my name is Rosalind. I am head of security services at a software development firm called Opencast. We are based in the Northeast, and we do kind of people-led software development. I'm also kind of a friend of B-Sides. I've previously presented back in November at Bristol B-Sides, where I spoke about everyone's favourite buzzword, which is artificial intelligence. Don't worry, we won't be playing any AI bingo here. I won't be talking about that throughout this talk. But instead, I'm going to talk a little bit about cyber defence for the final frontier, or securing the space industry. So you might be asking yourself kind of, why space? And I think the answer is kind of quite obvious. Space is cool. It is something that's quite close to my heart in terms of growing up as a child doing kind of amateur astronomy with my dad. In my kind of my day-to-day with my work in the Northeast, we have a lot of like kind of space centers around us. There's a lot of investment in space tech. So it's something that's particularly interesting. And also as a woman in STEM, people like Margaret Hamilton, who designed the Apollo guidance system for the Apollo 11, which landed Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong on the moon. She's someone who was like kind of a key role model for myself. This picture in particular is her in 1969, next to all of the lines of code that she wrote for the Apollo 11 mission. And I also believe that the greatest kind of gift that humans have is curiosity. And space is kind of that, you know, limitless field of possibility and curiosity. And the frame I've included down here is actually recently, in order to test long-range communication methods, NASA fired a video of a cat playing with a laser pen about 15 million miles away. So all in all, space is cool. I want to talk about it. So I thought I'd talk a little bit around the role of computer science in space travel. And now I'm not looking to kind of go through this all in its complete form. If you are interested, I would highly recommend reading or listening to Tim Peake's Space, which kind of lists out all of the different aspects of space travel, all the way from the 1950s, the early Mercury programs, things like the Soyuz rocket that took Gagarin to the moon. It kind of works through each of those stages. So I would really highly recommend, if you're interested, if you're passionate, if you've got a slight hyperfixation on it like I do, that you go and you kind of research more around it. But in short, the advent of space travel started in the 1950s, and for the past 70 years has developed across various different programs. Internationally, collaboration is like a kind of a key factor of that. And then all the way up into the 2000s and 2010s, where we're seeing advancement, we're seeing private space travel, and we're also seeing space tourism. So as you can kind of see, we're getting kind of from these early space systems, the shift in the level of technology with these space systems is kind of, has been quite exponential over the past 70 years. Now, I've just included this slide just to kind of outline systems engineering as a whole. I would highly recommend, if you are interested in launching your own rocket or simulating launching your own rocket, that you follow the link here for the Apollo 11, the Git repo, where you can create your own simulation that's based off of the system that you can see above. So this is the Apollo guidance computer and DISCI, which is the two key systems that were used during all of the Apollo launches. So these are guidance. This is for both first and second stage rocket. So as you can see, a lot of information, a lot of data. Now, really what I want to talk about is I want to talk about this blend that we need to recognize when we work with operational technology and information technology. If you come from like a cybersecurity background like I do, data is incredibly important. And that is consistent across all industries, whether it's healthcare, energy, or whether it's things like the space industry. In particular, for space travel, we have to consider what purpose the data is being used for. And that then informs the level of risk that is carried around that particular piece of data. So things like trajectories and celestial mechanics, how are we going to get there, how fast, how are we going to get into orbit, are particularly important. Being able to communicate in real time from your space operations, and ultimately the IP that sits around your spacecraft design in the first place, are all valuable data points that we have to consider when we're looking to protect our information. Now, I think all of us will probably be quite familiar with the CIA triad. So for those who aren't aware, this is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And when we talk about data security or information security, what we're really talking about is maintaining the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of that information. What we can do is we can actually take this a step further, and we can kind of break it down into more kind of granular parts. And actually, what we see is the addition of non-repudiation, authentication, privacy, and safety. And if you think about in the context of space travel, aerospace, any manufacturing, energy systems, for example, nuclear, wind, water, whatever, that end piece around safety is actually the thing that drives us predominantly when we think about information security and cybersecurity for space systems. And this is no small task. It's really quite difficult, actually, to combine safety and security. And this is for kind of a variety of different reasons. So they tend to be quite divergent priorities. Although they'd have the same mission of wanting to protect users, protect data, they quite often have different routes there. There's also kind of a bit of a, I guess, cultural difference between those two topics in terms of how we deal with kind of legacy systems. You know, it's always been this way. So why would we change it? Why should we focus on security? What is cybersecurity anyway? I just launched the rocket. Let's just send it up. And also the fact that space itself has a unique environment with a unique set of variables, which means that actually managing security and managing the control of information in these environments is particularly difficult. What I've just included here is, if you're interested, there is a really great talk that was run by Dr. Emma Taylor. It was last November at Bristol B-Sides, and she actually is a visiting professor from Cranfield University and a doctor of engineering, and she speaks really quite well about this particular topic. And so if you're interested in how you kind of balance those two pieces around security and safety, I'd really implore you to check her out. So what are some of the key challenges for cyber in space? So we have a lot of communication challenges. So we have long communication delays. It's no surprise that if we send a rocket up and it's really far away, we're going to have a slight bit of latency around our communication. We also have limited bandwidth as well. So transmitting large amounts of data securely actually means that there is the need for efficient data management and efficient encryption strategies. As a result, you tend to get quite a lot of space systems that have a lot of insecure protocols, because we need the availability is far more important than maybe the integrity or confidentiality of the data that we're sending. So we're having to make a bit of a balance between that operational latency and then actually the security of the data that we're transmitting. We also have a lot of operational risks that we have to balance. So the vast distances themselves means that it's quite hard to actually, you can't just SSH in and fix a thing. You have to think about these problems ahead of time and kind of retrofit. There's also dependency on automation as well. So, increasing the resilience of these automated systems. We've just had that wonderful talk around Jurassic Parks and those automated interlinked systems. It's all really important that they work cohesively together and that the data integrity is preserved, so that a decision being made by one system isn't that has a knock-on effect on another system isn't the incorrect decision, basically. And also things like radiation exposure, physical access limitations. We also have as well kind of even more kind of, I guess, power constraints in terms of actually what we can take on a rocket. We're quite limited in our space. So we have limited processing power. So we need to make sure our systems are efficiently built and are not using too many resources. I wanted to talk a little bit as well around some of the challenges around actually creating a proper threat model for space travel. I think what's really important to note is there's kind of divergent priorities when it comes to space travel. and protecting the information that we have and that we use for these particular systems is really important. But just some key questions that we can begin to build out is, if safety is the utmost priority, where does cybersecurity sit on the ladder of risks to prioritize? How do we quantify and communicate that risk to our investors, our stakeholders? If you think about the space tourism industry, there's huge volumes of money that are going into that. How are we balancing that level of the investment and the priorities of the investors with the reality of the vulnerabilities that sit within these systems? And also, where does the threat model begin and where does it end? As you might expect, if you're building a space travel or, a satellite, you've kind of got a long list of suppliers, a really long supply chain, by which, you'll have your initial blueprints that are then engineered all the way up to your final product. So actually thinking about third, fourth and fifth party risk is something that needs to be actively considered. And we'll see on the next slide, a lot of these kind of threat actors and potential disruption come from mismanagement of these risks and not understanding exactly where our threat model are. So I've just included up here some of the threat actors that we can consider. It should be no surprise that things like state-sponsored attacks are particularly important. If you think about the space race as a whole, it's always been a bit of a dichotomy and a bit of a battle, and it's resulted in a lot of the time, intellectual property being kind of a key target, but also as well disrupting real-time like flight coordination data. So commercial espionage as well. I mentioned the huge volume of money that sits behind space tourism. Much like the Jurassic Park example, there's usually a strong motivator there for actually gaining those trade secrets and actually being able to breach into these systems is quite financially viable. And then once again, that kind of pivots quite easily down into cyber criminal activities and just people doing it for fun. So NASA was hacked in 1999 by not to anyone's surprise, a 15-year-old kid who managed to get access to one of their main systems, breached a lot of information on, potential kind of astronaut crews and loads of PII. Since then, it hasn't really gotten that much better, to be honest. I think just the defenses are more complex, but also so are the adversaries that target them. But we can kind of see some of the potential impacts. So disruption of satellite operations. This is going to be really key and critical over the next couple of years, where we're seeing the advent of CubeSats and using, satellites for kind of committing, I guess, nation states using them maliciously and disrupting kind of satellite communication is particularly important. So there's a big potential impact in terms of that disruption of that satellite information. Compromised space missions. I mean, this is something that's fairly obvious. If my data is not accurate, I can't send my rocket into orbit. I can't get it out of the atmosphere. There's all sorts of things that could go wrong. And also things like data manipulation can also lead to complete failure of space missions. So we can see examples of that recently with SpaceX. They've been trying to launch rockets and get them to basically land back where they launched them from. And that's requiring a huge volume of a lot of kind of inertia, momentum, loads of physics that sits behind that. And compromising that data obviously leads to rockets falling over and exploding. So what are some of the common threats that we can experience in the space system? To be honest, none of these should be that surprising. A lot of the challenges and the issues, but also a lot of the key measures of success in terms of embedding cybersecurity for a space system are very similar to the common threats that we see in kind of other industries. So number one at the top there is that unauthorized access piece. Is the person accessing the information like they're supposed to? That authentication piece. It also leads into manipulation and that non-repudiation point I talked about when I talked about CIANA plus PS. Supply chain vulnerabilities shouldn't be a surprise. 80% cybersecurity incidents are usually supply chain vulnerabilities. Ransomware, malicious insider, and denial of service. All of these things are very, very common throughout all of our experience in terms of cybersecurity controls and risks that we're trying to sit against. But there are some other kind of specific, space-specific risks. So debris management, spoofing, and electromagnetic interference. All of these present potential risks to life if they go wrong. That's why ensuring that we have kind of, accurate tracking data, that we're alleviating our systems of navigation errors that's caused by cyber breaches, or that, communication is maintained, means that we can prevent these kind of risks crystallizing and impacting our systems. So I've spoken a little bit about risk, a bit about threat models and how we kind of build that out. I'm going to talk a little bit now about the types of vulnerabilities for space systems. It should kind of come as no surprise that space systems are quite complex code bases, which means that the integrity of the code to begin with is incredibly important. Flaws within software can lead to it leads to exploits and then unauthorized access. Once we're kind of using software and code bases, it's very difficult for us to change them. So if there's a fundamental flaw and you've already sent your rocket up, it's going to be quite tough to actually remediate any of those issues. Compromised components. So this is something that's particularly prevalent when we're thinking about our third party, fourth party, fifth party due diligence, and that whole piece around, we're building this rocket using our IP. One, has our IP been compromised in the first place? But two, are the people that are building it, have we vetted them accurately? Do we understand the risk that they carry? And that leads into kind of, really maintaining that third party security. Also, things like network vulnerabilities. A lot of the protocols that we use when we talk about operational technologies are things like Modbus, which are inherently vulnerable, and they're vulnerable for a reason. But that then leads these systems to be particularly vulnerable, as they're being used, which means that, they're way more prone to getting attacked. And then that means that there will be like a compromise of mission critical data. And then ultimately, on the kind of the ground level, authentication weaknesses. If we have someone who's able to manipulate, like ground kind of flight control information, then we have a really significant risk there that the system itself will completely fail. So, what's next? There's a lot of talk about kind of collaboration and standardization across the space industry, and I think that this is quite important when we consider how do we manage an industry or manage a particular sector that has such wildly varying levels of risk attributed with it. And I think all of us may be familiar with like various standards like NIST and ISO 27001, things like that. And they're actually, the European Space Agency and NASA are working together to kind of formalize this, their own framework for spacecraft, not only design, but the cybersecurity controls that need to be in place on these ships in order to maintain the integrity of the data that's stored on them. So a lot of international collaboration is happening at the minute to understand what the path looks like in order to get from, the current state, which is, we're seeing hacks like every so often someone will breach into like a particular satellite, and basically implementing like a lot more of a robust governance around cybersecurity. So it may be something that comes up and is more heavily regulated in the future. I'd also like to talk a little bit around some of the future trends as well. So quantum computing is particularly interesting. There's the impact of the fact that we can do, quantum resistant encryption, which means that transmit of that encrypted data is more secure. It presents more challenges and opportunities as well. Much like AI and machine learning, AI data hijacking is quite a common issue in the aerospace and the space industry. And this is mainly due to kind of like poisoning of like data sets and things like that. All of the things that we're quite comfortable with when we talk about AI and some of the limitations that we have. But there's also kind of could have, as I previously mentioned, like the emergence of different kind of space traffic management installations, which is focusing on kind of prioritizing the quality of that space travel information and making sure that there's effective communications in place, and also failovers as well at the same time, so there's a level of resilience. So we're avoiding collisions. We're avoiding collisions of satellites. When satellites come to end of life, we've got like a planned kind of recycling, releasing them back to the Earth in a controlled manner. And also as well, CubeSat security. So CubeSats are becoming ever increasingly more popular by using kind of, addressing a number of challenges by using these kind of small satellites, which means that they're more accessible, they're easier, and they're smaller, and they're more cost effective. So really alleviating some I guess resource limitations in terms of the industry itself. But ultimately, it comes down to a lot of the ingenuity and the curiosity. And cybersecurity for space systems is quite similar in terms of the different industries that you guys all probably work in. And it ultimately comes back to that final piece, which is around the confidentiality, integrity, availability of that information being protected. Cool. And that's everything. Thank you. I'll take any questions. Hi. Sorry, what was that? Oh, the space debris. Yeah. So we're getting to there's been a bunch of papers that have been released around reaching that like critical mass. And I think that, yes, basically we're getting to a point of no return, definitely. But that equally, there's a lot of work that's happening currently, specifically in the European Space Agency, around mitigating and putting restrictions on those satellites going into new satellites going into orbits, and actually recommissioning some of the old ones. So I think we are becoming at as you said, like a critical kind of tipping point with it. But also equally, I think it's something that we've been aware of for years, since we first started sending satellites up. And, the European Space Agency is working quite proactively in order to mitigate that risk. So who's to say? Hopefully they don't all fall out all at once, though. That's the main thing. Cool. Any other questions? Hi.
Space has always towed the line between this military thing and a thing just for the best humanity. Do you think that affects how we view threats currently? And do you think we're going to see a greater divide between those kind of two realms as it becomes more of a place we exist in?
Absolutely. I think there's always going to be geopolitical pressures. When we look at any emerging technology, there's always a level of, you have those the innovators that are really pushing for the use cases that they're pushing it for, which in most cases, if we look at the origins of AI, it's kind of for betterment of humanity and for solving problems and for people first. But ultimately with the development of any kind of new technology or any new industry, there is that geopolitical tension that usually sits alongside it. And we have seen an increase in the number of attacks on kind of satellite communications over the past couple of years since 2022. So there's definitely, as it's becoming more prevalent, we're also getting more investment into different space systems. There's definitely going to be a bit of a bit of a balance that needs to be struck. I think something, working towards regulation is particularly important in those scenarios. So you have at least rules that at least, the majority work to, basically. Hi.
So I guess there's a level of reliance on industry systems like PLCs, or whatever.
Yeah.
With that, and the limits in bandwidth, limits of ability to actually touch those systems, is there a bit of a concern around legacy equipment and vulnerability?
Yeah, absolutely. So going back to Apollo 11 and Margaret Hamilton and the systems she built, that was 7 systems. In contrast, you have around about 200 to 250 systems on modern spacecraft, all of which are kind of independently, maybe not built in an architecture independently, but they'll be independently developed but will have dependencies on other systems. So there is probably, as is with lots of large kind of monolithic architectures, the risk that, as you said, legacy systems are used. I mentioned as well things like using like insecure protocols, like things like Modbus. That's like fairly, if you look at operational technology as a whole, we tend to use insecure protocols specifically for the reason of we want to be able to see who's saying what to our tooling. So yeah, it's definitely a problem. I think what we're getting though is, as we're getting more and more investment, especially in the private sector around like space tourism, you'll probably see kind of a bit of a push away from these kind of legacy systems. But ultimately, yes, there'll definitely be a mix in there. Cool.
So I'm going to wrap it up now, I'm afraid. Thank you.
Thank you.